So let's take a look at how do scientists study life. Well, it can be studied at many different levels. An atom is the smallest particle of an element, so elements are made up of atoms. And atoms retain all the properties of the element they make up. Atoms may combine to form molecules, and molecules can come together and make organelles, which are the building blocks for each cell. And remember, cells are the basic units of life. When cells of a similar structure and function come together, they form tissues. And when tissues come together, especially at least two types of tissues, but sometimes all four, like muscle tissue and connective tissue, nervous tissue, epithelial tissue, they form organs. Organs can work together as organ systems, like the heart and blood vessels, making up the cardiovascular system. Many multicellular organisms are composed of multiple organ systems. And when you take all of these organ systems together as a whole, you're really looking at the organism. Moving on from the organismal level, if we're looking at organisms of the same species living in a similar geographic area, you're looking at a population. And when populations interact, you're looking at a community. What about when those communities interact with their surrounding environment? When they interact with things like rocks and wind and other non living components? Well, then you're looking at an ecosystem. A community and its non living environment is an ecosystem. And all the ecosystems of the Earth compose the biosphere. Here we have kind of that pathway from large biosphere to small atom. It goes biosphere, ecosystem, community, population, organism, organs and organ systems, organs making up organ systems, then tissue, cell, organelle, molecule, and atom. Atoms and molecules are definitely on that kind of chemical scale, whereas we get into kind of gross or macro anatomy when we're looking at cells and tissues and organ systems, meaning we don't need a microscope to see them. And then we move on more into ecology with population, community, ecosystem, and biosphere. But this biological organization is really helpful for scientists to study life. Putting things in order, organization, is a key component to how scientists study. Figure 110 in your book is a great resource to go back and look at. It not only gives you the definition for all of these levels of biological organization, it also gives you a picture example. So, for example, Earth's surface, because that's where all the ecosystems are, that's the biosphere. Looking at a food web or a food tree, plus the environment or non living surroundings, that's an ecosystem. Looking at multiple organisms in a similar geographic area working together, that's a community. Usually, a population is made up of only one species, and so those species have to be interacting to be looking at a community, but a single population is just made up of one species that are all organisms that are similar enough to interbreed. And then we can go back down to the organism level, made up of many organ systems made up of organs, tissues, which are groups of similar cells that perform a similar function, make up organs. Usually, at least two types of tissue are needed to make up an organ, and those tissues are made up of cells, many different types of cells, especially in multicellular organisms, and they're a combination of molecules, such as the building blocks called organelles. And molecules are made up of atoms, which are the smallest unit of matter, also known as the smallest particle of an element that still retains all the properties of that element. So definitely something to go back and look at and make sure you're familiar with. Let's continue on and talk about some more organization. We could, for example, look at evolutionary relationships among organisms. We can start with kind of these three major groups called domains: bacteria, archaea, kind of like old bacteria, and eukarya. Inside domain eukarya are all of the eukaryotic organisms. So inside domain bacteria and archaea are all the prokaryotic organisms. And there's going to be some fundamental differences among the cell types that we find in these groups. Here's the overall organization for the domains of life. Doesn't have a lot of information here, but you can see the three domains: domain bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. In domain eukarya, you have protists, which is a now defunct kingdom, plants, fungi, and animals. But we kind of still function under this organization, even though protists are being reorganized. In domain bacteria and archaea, so in the blue and yellow, those are where all of our prokaryotic cells are. And all our eukaryotic cells can be found in domain eukarya. So domains, bacteria and archaea, prokaryotes. Domain eukarya is eukaryotes. And I want to caution you using terms like simple cells, less complex, because remember, all of the prokaryotic cells and all the eukaryotic cells can carry out all of the properties of life. So simple, less complex, those words are fine, but make sure you know what it means. It doesn't mean that they don't carry out as many properties. It just means they might not have as much stuff as, say, eukaryotic cells if we're comparing them to prokaryotic cells. So just keep that in mind. All right, so moving on from looking at bacteria and archaea, we're going to take a closer look at domain eukarya. So that's where all the eukaryotic organisms are. They have 3 multicellular kingdoms. They used to have 4, but notice that Protista or Protus is missing. Those are currently being reorganized and probably will be reorganized into these 3 kingdoms. The plant kingdom, Plantae, fungi, like mushrooms and mold, and Animalia, which is where we're at. So kingdom is slightly more specific than a domain. And so inside of these kingdoms, you find things like plants, which carry out photosynthesis, produce their own food, fungi, which are sometimes known as saprophobes or detritophores. So they kind of take their nutrients from their surroundings, possibly, sometimes, maybe, decaying material. And then animals obtain their food by eating it and digesting other organisms, whether it be plants or animals, or both. So here are some pictures to help us kind of just categorize what we're talking about in our heads. So domain bacteria and archaea are 2 big groups, both made up of prokaryotic cells. They're both bacteria. The ones that are usually pathogenic are the ones we're calling bacteria, those that are extremophiles and live in boiling hot springs or the bottom of the ocean or in trash dumps with all that methane. Those are more archaea. They're kind of archaic or old bacteria, but both are prokaryotes and they don't have a nucleus. Then you have eukarya, where we have all the eukaryotic organisms, some unicellular, some multicellular. It includes plants, animals, and fungi. It does include the protists. Just because that kingdom no longer exists doesn't mean we're not including them. We're just noting they're being reorganized because there's fungi-like, animal-like, and plant-like protists. And it's these 3 domains that set up our 3 groups that fit within the idea of taxonomy, which is a study of classification, and the study of evolutionary relationships, which is phylogeny. Oftentimes we can depict these domains and their subgroups in a phylogenetic tree, which is a diagram that shows all the evolutionary relationships among biological species and how they're similar or different. We have been able to strengthen and update phylogenetic trees thanks to molecular data, which DNA technology has allowed us to create. A lot of phylogenetic trees, though, were created when we didn't have that molecular data, so they are constantly being updated as new information becomes available. So when we're talking about this organization, that's a little bit of what you've seen thus far. But what are we looking at organizationally? We're looking at a binomial system that starts with the genus and ends with the species. This is a naming system for organisms. It allows us to make sure that as scientists, we're talking about the same organism. In one area, we might call an organism a water flea. It might be something else in another area. But thanks to the binomial naming system, scientists are able to study life and not get confused about what organism we're talking about. So the water flea in science is Daphnia longispina. And we can see that we made it to the genus species binomial or 2 name system by going through this classification system. It's an organism classification system. It starts with domain, then gets a little narrower or more specific with kingdom. Then you get a little bit more specific with phylum, and you probably are getting the hang of this now, more specific with class, more specific with order, then family, genus, and species are getting more and more specific. So this organism classification system culminates in the 2 name system called binomial nomenclature. And this binomial nomenclature makes sure that we know the name of an organism scientifically, so we're not confused when we're writing scientific papers what organism someone's writing about. So a lot of times in different regions, you have colloquial or common names that aren't familiar to others that are not of that region. So for example, we could look at a dog. A dog is in domain Eukarya because they're a multicellular eukaryotic organism. They're an animal, that's their kingdom, they're not plants or fungi. They have a nerve cord, so they're in phylum Chordata. They have mammary glands, so they're in class Mammalia. They're carnivores, so they're in order Carnivora. Their family is Canidae, which includes dogs, wolves, coyotes, and foxes. Their genus is Canis, which takes out foxes and still includes dogs, wolves, and coyotes. And then their species is Canis lupus, which is the same as a wolf. Over time, we may see dogs become a separate species from wolves, but they're not currently. Genetically, they can still interbreed. So when we're talking about science, we're talking about something that is organized, that is systematic, that asks questions, that observes, that forms experiments. And all of these aspects are to really help us utilize science to understand our physical universe. So science is definitely evidence-based, and science changes if new information becomes available. When we talk about the scientific approach, it involves things like observations, hypotheses, predictions, tests, and also experiments. Sometimes those experiments work, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they strengthen our resolve around our data. Other times they prove our data wrong. Sometimes they're not able to be replicated. And then that's bad experimentation. And we have to update things constantly to make sure that we have the best possible data, experiments, and information. So science is ever changing as a systematic inquiry system. So that's what we're going to be looking at next. What is science?